Welcome to Deep Drinks Podcast, where the drinks are deep and the conversations are deeper. Does time exist? What is time? These are some big questions that may not feel like they need to be questions, but they are important questions because the topic, as my guest says, is a little prickly. My guest today is Michael Granado, who is currently completing his PhD in philosophy at Staffordshire University. His research focuses on Gaston Bachelard. Oh my gosh, I asked a million times how to pronounce it. I keep getting it wrong. On Gaston Bachelard's philosophy of time. Bachelard presents a relational theory of time that attempts to reconcile the developments of relativity theory with our psychological experience of time using analogies drawn from quantum mechanics. Oh my gosh, I apologize for that intro, but welcome guest Michael Granado. Thank you for coming on, Michael. My gosh.
No worries. No worries.
Oh my God. I have to preface this by saying I haven't had much sleep. We've got a newborn, and last night I only got a few hours sleep, and sometimes my brain just reboots like that.
It's all good. You have a built-in fantastic excuse. You have no one to apologize to. It's all right.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. So this topic is an interesting one. One, because a lot of people don't realize that it is interesting because people just think time's time. And then another thing is because it's one of those things that is incredibly complex, and it's going to be a fun game to try and keep it as entertaining as possible. I said to Michael, we want to be somewhere between Joe Rogan experience and a scientific lecture. So like somewhere in the middle of that. So before we sorry, someone said Michael Granado is getting his PhD in Baccarat. Got it. Okay. Oh my gosh. Sorry, everyone. I'm not very good at that. I'll post the actual name in the chat so everyone can see.
Yeah.
So, Michael, what are we drinking today, first of all?
Yeah. So I figured we'd spice it up a little bit. This was when you were doing your sober January, I think it was.
Yeah.
We're drinking a tea, Yerba Mate. I came across this because I have a really nasty caffeine. I mean, it's a full-blown addiction. But I've been trying to not drink 5 pots of coffee a day, and so I switched to tea, especially tea that's not as caffeinated. And Yerba Mate is kind of I think the closest thing to it is like a green tea.
Okay.
Still got caffeine in it, by the way. It's just not it's not the espresso shots I'm doing. So.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. Well, I've never had it before. And when you sent it to me, I thought you were joking because I thought you misspelled something, because as an Australian, I read it as yerba mate. And I was like, yerba mate. I thought you were saying like you want to do herbal tea, mate. Like I thought that's what you were saying. So anyway. So first question, let's jump straight into it. Does time exist?
Right. Oh yeah, we'll just start off with that. Okay, so as David and I were talking about this before, philosophy of time is one of those areas of philosophy that is, let me say some negative characteristics first. Overly pretentious comes to mind. It can be very, very academic and dense, oftentimes unnecessarily so. And I say all that to say that there's this phrase that the Buddha uses in one of the dialogues where he's talking about trying to achieve enlightenment, and he says that it's like trying to tie the air into knots. It's like a fruitless, useless that's exercise. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a lot of academic philosophy. And I especially feel that that's the case with the philosophy of time. So I'm going to throw around some philosophical jargon. I'm going to try to keep it as as jargon free as possible, but let me actually answer your question.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
another thing just to mention, you wanted me. Why is my brain? Am I having a stroke? Why you wanted me to make it known that you're definitely not a physicist. However,
Right.
this is your PhD thesis, right? You're like,
Mhm.
well, the arguments around this is your PhD thesis. So you may
Right.
not be behind a telescope or under a microscope like studying this stuff, but I don't even know, say you don't study that stuff like that, but you are an expert in the arguments around this. So
Yes. Thank you for that. So let me talk a little bit about what I study and then answer your question. If
cool.
this
Yeah,
might
let's do
actually
that.
be somewhat helpful. Because sometimes when I tell people what I study, they invite me on and then they ask me a bunch of questions about physics, which I barely passed high school algebra. Okay, maths is not my thing. But I study philosophy, a branch of philosophy called philosophy of. So we're going to start big and then go narrow and narrow and narrow. I study philosophy, but most of my background's actually in history, the history of science. So I have 2 master's degrees. One is in the history of early modern science, basically Isaac Newton, Samuel Clarke, Leibniz, German philosopher, and this debate that they had. Then my second master's in history was in the reception of Darwinism in the United States. So most of my academic background's in history. Well, what am I doing with a PhD in philosophy? The history of science kind of merges with the philosophy of science, especially in the French tradition. The French have this long tradition of what they call historic epistemology, which is contextualizing knowledge. And for early 20th century French philosophers, contextualizing knowledge meant putting it within its proper historic context, even forms of knowledge like science. And that's kind of what I'm doing. So I'm studying philosophy, but I'm looking at philosophical issues from the early 20th century. So it has more of a historic bent to it. So I'm going to be tossing around a lot of philosophic and scientific jargon, but my academic background's not in science. It's firmly in history of science, and in a very small area of the philosophy of science, if that makes sense.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I can attempt to answer the first question.
Yeah. Yeah. So does time exist?
Does time exist? So there are two big schools of thought here with respect to time that relate to this question: does time exist? Which I'll dig into a little bit more. But let me just start off by saying time, as defined by relativity theory and by some aspects of quantum mechanics, Einstein famously said that time is just what clocks measure. So does time exist? Well, not to sound like a pedantic philosopher, but it depends on what you mean by exist. So time would be, in that respect, a kind of like a second order phenomenon, in the same way that money exists. Right. So money exists, but it's a social construct, in the sense that the value that we as human beings place on money causes it to exist socially. We all use it and agree that it has like a social function. But if you were to take away humanity, would money exist? No. Right. Because money is something that humans use. Early 20th century physics will say something very, very similar about time. That time is what clocks measure. To put it in Einstein's words, is a very functional account of what time is. And so if you take away clocks, i.e., if you take away humans, is there time? At first glance, no. If we're just talking about the special theory of relativity and the general theory of relativity, time is very functional in that regard, meaning it's a function of measurement. Now, that changes in later 20th century physics with the introduction of in quantum mechanics of fields and of the space-time manifold. So I would say that it just depends on what you mean by exist. We can start there. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say I do see everyone's comments. I'm just going to we will get around to answering them and engaging in a sec. It's just that we've got to kind of set the foundation in less time than an hour or so before we can we've got to set the foundation first. So I remember the reason I kind of asked you that question is because I was scratching my brain last night, writing down some notes on what I could ask you about this. And I remember having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Lauren. And Lauren and I we actually deconstructed our faith together, kind of like over Facebook Messenger, just like talking a lot about it. And she mentioned we talk about science a lot, and it's been a while since I've talked about science, but I actually we would throw kind of stoner points out to each other every now and again, like, what if life is this, and what if, not that I'm a stoner, or not that, but I remember I found the comment and I paraphrased what I essentially said, which was time is a construct that we as a society have invented to account for the decay rate of atoms, the changing of seasons, and the rotation of Earth around the sun. The concept of time is an arbitrary tool and only exists if our the concept of time is an arbitrary tool and only exists in our subconscious experience. So it's almost like time is like an inch, right? Like you can determine what an inch is, but an inch or a foot or a mile only exists in so much as it's an arbitrary length that we have determined that is a tool, but like pointing somewhere into the in the material universe to show us what we can describe an inch, but we can't point to somewhere in the universe and say the universe says that this is an inch. We've arbitrarily chosen parts of the universe to say this is what represents an inch. But what's interesting about the concept around time is, and this might be the same case with an inch, to put it into perspective of an inch may be different depending on where you are in the universe. So an inch might actually change. Not really, not inches, but time will actually change, right? So like we're going to go into a little bit of like the twin paradox and relativity and things like that, but time can actually be different for two different people in very real and practical ways that have, I guess, I'll ask you about this later, but have actually been shown to, well, not shown, but have actually happened. So,
right.
Yeah, that's where we started.
No, that's good. I mean, it's good that you phrase it like that, because asking,
that's a good friend of mine.
Oh man, that's good.
So for those listening, someone said there are only 4 important inches in my life. So okay. Sorry.
Oh, I could just see one of my high schoolers watching this video.
Yeah.
So I like the nature of the question, because it gets to one of the fundamental distinctions in the philosophy of time. And this is what makes philosophy of time interesting intellectually, and also what makes it practical for a lot of people. Most people have a general idea of what time is. Like you could go to an elementary school, or to a group of, I forget that you're not American, a group of like 4 to 8 year olds, and ask them, hey, what do you think time is? And they would be able to articulate and describe some aspects and features of what time is. And this is what makes the problem of time in philosophy incredibly difficult. Is philosophers call this, one of the phrases that they use is called manifest time. And manifest time is how time appears to us. So strictly from a phenomenological, or how we experience it, time has certain qualities to it. So common phrases that people toss around is that time moves, time flows. Wow, that time really went by. or I can't believe it's February already. It seemed like the year just started. Like there are all of these basic everyday kind of phrases that we throw around, these like what are they called, idioms that we use on a regular basis that have these common characteristics, that time has a flow or a movement or a pace to it. And this also seems to be reflected just in basic observations about our life, right? We were born, we had a childhood, we went into young adult, and we make sense of our lives via some sort of temporal narrative, right? We tell stories about ourselves and about who we are as people. And that narrative assumes that, this sounds silly, but we got to start silly when we're talking with philosophy, that the past was real, that the past existed, that I was there, and that I have transitioned through that past to the present. And so I'm telling this, building this story, right?
Because there's an argument like with hard solipsism that like essentially we don't know that we were just created at right this second, and all our memories are were implanted into us right at this second, right?
Yeah.
So we got to kind of go like, let's pretend we didn't hear that, and let's move, like, so we can at least investigate the argument.
Right.
Yeah.
Global skepticism is an almost impossible philosophical position to, it's fun to talk about, but you got to get on with day-to-day life eventually. But so that's what manifest time is. Now, here's the kicker. The description of manifest time, that we have a past, that I've been growing older, that I have this story that I tell myself and about my past, that is, according to science, fundamentally wrong from the perspective of physics. So this is why time is an issue and why it's a philosophical problem, because our perception of what time is inherently at odds with the scientific descriptions that we have of time. So what are we supposed to do about that? How are we supposed to make sense of that? And this creates a domino effect, right? Because if I can be that wrong about time, this is where the global skepticism comes in, right? Because it is one of the most certain things to me that I had a childhood, that X, Y, and Z event happened, and that I am here where I am today. Like, if I have fundamental reason to doubt that, that's a pretty confident core belief. What else goes out the window with it?
Yeah.
So this is why this question is epistemologically, when it comes to knowledge, this is why it's so fundamental, why it's so important.
I have a random question. I heard a theory that metabolic rate can change your perception of time. Is that true?
Yeah, well, okay. So I'll talk about this a little later, but some more distinctions that we can draw is between physical time, experienced time, or psychological time, and biological time. And what the field of psychology has showed us over like the past 50 years or so is that your personal experience of time is highly subjective and malleable. So I don't know if specifically your metabolic rate can change your perception of time, but there's a whole host of things that can change your perception of time. Your whether or not you're experiencing pleasure at that moment can change your perception of time. All sorts of stuff.
I don't know if this was just a meme or if it was actually something that Einstein said, but it was like Einstein was asked about the theory of relativity, and he said like it's something like, compare yourself talking to a beautiful lady versus putting your hand on a hot plate, and that's relativity. Like the time moves very differently. Is that actually something that he said, or is that just a meme?
Oh, boy. So I've heard that before. Not only have I heard it before, I've read it in books before, but I have not been able to track down that quote. So I think it's about 50-50. He said something similar, but it wasn't quite phrased that way. But
how annoying is it when you, because just a random aside again, you know the phrase that everyone gets wrong, the love of money is the root of all evil, but everyone thinks it's money is the root of all evil, but it's not.
Right.
And everyone attributes that to Jesus. I was reading some like older philosophy, way older than Jesus, and I forgot who it was, but it was like they said the love of money is the root of all evil before Jesus. So I was like, wow. I was like, so did Jesus know about this? Is this like a fundamental truth that Jesus just got as well, or did he know about these philosophers? And I haven't been able to find an answer to that online. Anyway, I digress. Continue.
No, it's okay. History of science, it's not nearly as bad as the history of religion. But there are, well, it's not bad in the sense that in the history of religion, there are so many like misconceptions about it. That's what I meant, not to downplay the history of religion. But there are so many misquotes to Einstein and Darwin and Newton. They're just like all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So why does this create a problem in philosophy?
Yes. So there is a long tradition in philosophy dealing with questions of epistemology. So in philosophy, epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What can we found the confidence of our beliefs in? What makes a justified true belief, to use good philosophical language, right? And there's a long tradition in philosophy that one of the most secure foundational ways to establish true belief is what philosophers would call intuition, or what most people would call like common sense, right? So think, if a an obtuse philosopher were to ask you, like, prove to me I'm holding a pen right now, how would you go about proving that? Well, most people would say, well, here's your pen. Here's my hand. Here's the pen. I'm holding it. Right.
Yeah.
And that works. Like that's how we learn about the world. Like that's our most basic, that's our like first form of knowledge. We want to know something. We want to figure something out. So we use our sense perceptions to deduce that thing, or to figure out that thing's there. And object permanence is one of the first types of knowledge that children have, right? How do I know that my mother's there? Because there she is, right? I'm the baby. There's my mom, and I know that my mom feeds me. So when my mom walks over, I know that I'm about to get food, right? That is like one of the most foundational types of ways of knowing. And this goes back in the French tradition, especially, to philosophers like René Descartes in the 17th century, who argued that true foundational knowledge is found in what he called clear and distinct ideas that appear clearly and distinctly to our mind's eye, and was followed up in the 19th and 20th century by other French philosophers like Henry Bergson. And when Bergson looked at a subject like time and said, okay, what do we know about time? What Bergson appealed to was our intuition of time, our common sense, that manifest image of what time is, and said, okay, we know that time has certain characteristics, like it's extended in duration, that we experience lapse of time. How do we know that we experience lapse of time? You literally experience lapse of time every day. So that's why this question is so important, and why it's a philosophical problem, because intuition and common sense has played such a foundational role in epistemology since the beginning of philosophy. And even, think about like talking to somebody on the street and asking them how they know something, right? That basic intuition, or that basic sense of common sense, is probably going to be the first thing they appeal to.
Yeah, it's so it's almost something that I pick up on in my journey of life, is that often our subjective experiences misleads us into the reality of things. An example I've used recently is like, let's say when you're a child, you get bitten on the face by like a chihuahua, and you're now scared of chihuahuas, right? You're scared of these like little dogs. Well, you might, and then someone asks you, how many chihuahua deaths are there per year? You might estimate more than 0, right? Which would be an incorrect. Well, actually, I don't know. There could be chihuahua deaths, but let's just say there isn't. The point is like your subjective experience can skew your results, and it's the same. That's where that's where things like racism come in. That's where like the news organizations work off our subjective fears and irrationalities. And I often find that my favorite quote to say, and my wife has grown to love it as well, is "Feelings aren't facts." And if I'm having an anxiety attack and I feel like the world's falling apart, the world isn't falling apart. Usually the anxiety attack is unjustified. Right. Most fear is irrational. So sometimes I feel subjectiveness actually skews us from perceiving the real world. And so I guess maybe we should go over the theories of time. So this substantive versus relational.
Yes. So let me make a quick comment about what you just said, and then I'll talk about this distinction, because the philosopher that I study, his name's Gaston Bachelard, and by the way, I mispronounce. So I study French philosophy, which means
Did you say Bachelard or Bacacocrac?
Bachelard. I mispronounce it all the time. And speaking about how pretentious philosophers are, like when I present at a philosophy conference and I'm sitting in a room of French philosophers and I say Bachelard, like I could just see the eyes rolling in the back of the head. They're like, who's this dumb American talking about our philosophy, right? I do it all the time. You just look at the comments on my video. People are correcting me constantly. So this is one of the fundamental philosophical distinctions between Bachelard and his main interlocutor, the person that he's arguing with, Henry Bergson. So Bergson's argument is that knowledge is founded and comes from intuition, that knowledge is founded and comes from common sense. And so when Bergson talks about time, he'll say that the fundamental characteristic of time is duration, that time is measuring a set length, right? And that's its most basic feature. Bachelard disagrees with that, which sounds kind of like, how could you disagree with that? Like that's just seems kind of like basic, right? Because of intuition. But Bachelard argues that, and Bachelard writes a lot about scientific epistemology, how science comes to know and understand the truth. And Bachelard says that science actually comes to truth via opposing intuition and via getting over and combating the certain biases that we have about the world. And our most basic fundamental bias is that reality is as it appears to me. That if I want to know the truth, I just look at it, there it is, and that's reality. But Bachelard says, well, on a superficial level, yes, like observation is a critical component to science. But oftentimes in science, things aren't quite as they appear to be, right? Just look at, Bachelard writes a lot about like early chemistry. Just look at early chemistry and early biology. One of the fundamental breakthroughs is the realization that the surface level appearance of the world is just that surface level, that there's all these like microorganisms and stuff at the bottom of everything that we had no clue existed. And that scientific epistemology, that scientific knowledge builds itself up by combating those biases and by going against those biases. So I just wanted to reiterate what you just said there.
Baccarat looks like this for anyone that looks like this. This is what he looks like, and the man looks wise. Let me just say that. someone has a question. Aaron has a question. Great to see you here, Aaron. Is the recognition of time or creation of time an evolutionary phenomenon? Example, if somewhere else in the universe there are beings with equal or greater intelligence than us, do they have time? And that a spin-off question, which is in the same vein, which is from Lauren, who I talked to last night, compiling some notes for this, is do other species have different biological systems of perceived time? So I've always wondered, like, this will sound strange, but does a fly feel like it's been alive for 2 days, or does it feel like it's been alive for much longer?
Yeah. So this goes back. Let me start off by saying that I have no idea. That's actually that would actually be like a testable psychological experiment.
Yeah.
Like you could actually work that out. I will say that I will say this. So yeah, please take what I say here with a hefty grain of salt, because again, not a scientist. I will say that human beings, depending upon geographical location, have different experiences of time. So there's this phrase of island time. I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
I was just about to say that. Yeah, I've experienced that when we were late for the airport at Vanuatu, because a taxi driver just got there whenever he felt like it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that is a real thing.
Yeah.
And what's happening there is that different people, depending upon their social status, where they're at, what they're doing, different people experience time in different ways. Now, do other species experience time? Again, that's I'm not touching that one.
Well, I think the problem that we don't have the answer is we've got a message from Digital Hammurabi who said, look at these two jokers on screen. Who on earth would listen to anything these atheists have to say? No spirit of God, no truth. Well, thank you, Digital Hammurabi. He always comes in to tell us. Yeah,
appreciate it.
He always comes in. No, he's a good friend. He's a good friend of the show. Good friend of mine.
Wonderful person. And speaking of a scholar, two scholars.
I think Josh can only be mean ironically, because he's just so kind. All the rest of
he is such a nice person.
Yeah. It's like, have you seen that episode of Seinfeld where Elaine tries to get Jerry Seinfeld to be angry and he just can't be angry, and then eventually he snaps? I feel like doing that with Dr. Josh sometimes. Like, get him angry. Actually, talk about slavery and say that, tell me why slavery's wrong, and then you get him angry. Which is
understandably so. I mean, if there's one thing you should be getting upset about, for sure. Argue with trying to convince people why slavery of all things. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, you want me to talk about the distinction here?
Yeah. Okay. Let's do the distinction.
Yes. So there's been two major theories of time that have existed since philosophy has existed. This goes in the Greek tradition. This goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. You even see debates about the nature of time in like ancient Indian philosophy of the Gupta Empire, like the 4th and 5th century BCE. Confucius famously didn't like metaphysical questions, so it kind of skirted. Confucius was funny because he said that he would ask one of his followers asked him what happened after we died. And Confucius's response was, well, you haven't figured out how to live, so why are you concerned with what happens after you die?
So dodging the question.
Anyway, I say all that to say, like, most peoples around the world thought about this question of time. The ancient Mayas developed this very elaborate and ornate cosmology that centered around this idea of cyclical time. It's everywhere. Now you have two different views that have emerged. One is this idea of substantive time, and relational time. So let me explain what that means. And I'm sorry, as soon as some guy with a philosophy background starts throwing around definitions, people just So substantive time is actually pretty straightforward. Substantive time, blah 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 blah. Substantive time is the idea that time has substance to it, has a substance to it. And in philosophy, the substance of a thing is that thing's primary characteristics. Okay, so Aristotle developed this idea of substance and said that different things have different substances. So the substance of a human is to be like animated, to be alive, right? We have this animating substance evident within all of us. Substance with respect to time, we've already talked about some of these characteristics. The substance of time might be that the most basic of which would be that time has a direction. We're moving from the past to the future. That's an inherent quality or substance of time. So substantive theories argue that time has certain basic fundamental features to it. There are different types of substance theories, the most popular of which is called a theory of time. The letter A theory of time. And what a theory of time states is that the different tenses, past, present, and future, are fundamental qualities. I keep doing this because for me, when I think in pictures. So when I think of time as a substance, I think of the time bar, right? The flow of time. So a theory is a substantive view of time because according to a theory, past, present, and future are real fundamental features of what time itself is. In other words, you take away humanity from the picture, the past still exists. And the present moment would still exist, and the future would come to exist.
Yep. I'm following.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
So it's not like it's like it exists, but like in so much so that it's not based purely on, maybe I don't get it. It's not based purely on human like experience. Okay.
Right. So it exists. When I talk about existence in the ontological sense, it exists independently of humans. And this is cool. Yeah. I say that to distinguish it from the relational theory of time, which I'll get to here in a second. And what does it mean for time to exist? It exists in the sense that time tenses, past, present, and future, are real features of reality. There really was a past. There really is a present. The moment that we're all currently experiencing right now is real, is tangible. And there are different views about this, and there really is, or at least there could be, a future. Now, so A theories, the two big theories, substantive view of time, relational view of time. Under the substantive view of time, we have A theory. Under A theory, you have about 6 different positions, which I won't go into, but a bunch of different offshoots of what that means.
The 6 layers of hell or whatever in Dante's Inferno.
It goes all the way down.
Yeah. I think it's like 9, or I can't get it wrong. But anyway, keep going.
No. So the easiest way to think of this would be that some atheists believe that a form of what's called presentism, which is that only the present moment is real, that the past isn't real, and that the future isn't real, that only now is real. Other atheists,
just like Deepak Chopra kind of philosophy, the power of now and all that.
Yes. Other atheists would support a position called the growing block theory. The easiest way to imagine this, most of the atheists who support this take a very particular view of Big Bang theory, which says that the universe began at a particular point in time and has since been expanding outwards. The growing block theory would say that in that universe, the past is real and the present moment is real, but the future doesn't exist yet.
Okay.
Because the past we can observe, right? We can look it through a telescope and see the past. It's there. It happened. That's it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then you also have something called the moving spotlight theory, which is a combination of A and B theory, but I think we're good on A theory.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And this is where it gets complicated and messy. So I said at the beginning of this podcast, YouTube.
Yeah. Podcast.
I said at the beginning that most physicists, and I even got to be careful with this, a large portion of 21st century physics lends itself best to B theory, not to A theory. But that is not to say that you can't go look up a physicist right now who supports a version of A theory, because they exist. I just read a book, Richard Mueller, who argues for a version of A theory. He's a physicist.
Okay.
So this isn't a settled debate. I just want to paraphrase that.
It's prickly.
Yes, very prickly.
Okay, so what is B theory then?
Absolutely. So B theory, so you have the substantive view of time and you have the relational view of time. B theory is a relationist view of time. It's relationist in the sense that tense, past, present, and future only exist in relation to observers. Us.
Okay.
Right? Not only that, but you have extreme relationist position, which says that my past is my past, but might not necessarily be your past, David. And so this is a completely relational, relative. You have on the one end of the extreme, the completely relativist view of time, which is that a sense of time is not only relational to the observer, but that every observer has their own sense and relation of time. So it's almost completely, to use your language, almost completely socially constructed, conventional.
Interesting.
And then somebody in the chat, SlamRN, brought up eternalism. So B theory of time holds that there is no privileged tense. Past, present, and future are all on the same level, so to speak. Because in the fundamental equations of relativity and in the fundamental equations of quantum mechanics, there really is no time doesn't factor into it. So there's no preference given. And in some cases, like in relativity, they could actually be exchangeable. That it doesn't matter. And that when we talk in relativity, when we talk about a time, we're talking about a particular time, this specific instance that happened at that specific point. And that when we're talking about past, we're talking about past in relation to that point.
Right.
Or future in relation to that point. So that's why it's called relationalism, because those tenses, past, present, and future, are relational to certain events, to those particular events.
Okay.
Hopefully that made sense.
That makes sense. So was Einstein a B theorist?
Here's where it gets even more complicated.
Okay.
He was, believe it or not, it depends on what period of time with Einstein you're talking about, because he was actually both.
Okay.
He kind of fluctuated.
Interesting.
When he first developed his theory of relativity, so Einstein writes his first paper on relativity, the electrodynamics of moving bodies, in 1905. And then starts to deliver a series of lectures at some German universities at 1915, 1920. By the 1920s, Einstein is firmly within the B theory camp. Now, this is completely anachronistic historically. A theory, B theory. Einstein wasn't familiar with that, but he would have been a B theorist.
Yeah.
He starts to go over a little bit into A theory, and this is where it gets well outside of my comfort zone. When he accepts the idea of the space-time manifold, so in general relativity, space and time become combined into one thing. And once you start to talk about things in philosophy, you start to talk about substance. That thing has a substance to it. And once you say that an aspect of space-time has a thingness to it, has a substance, so like space-time could be curved, for example. So it has attributes, it has qualities that would exist if we didn't exist. And so then you start to get into like this hybrid A/B theory that Einstein kind of supported later in life. So that's why I say it's prickly, it's complicated, because even with a single scientist, you're going to get some back and forth.
So before you mentioned that we can observe the past because we can see it through telescopes. So right now we're actually, like, if you were actually sitting in front of me, technically I would be viewing the past because of how long it takes for the light to like, I wouldn't be able to perceive it, but I could, the time it takes the light to come from you to reach my eyes is there's a gap of time there. So I'm technically viewing the past. But a better example is, we can see galaxies 13.8 billion light years away. And that's like right at the start of the start of the universe, right?
Yeah.
So it's right, like, when we see them how they were back then, it's taken that long for the light to travel to us. But Aaron asked the question, if scientists one day build a telescope that can look into the future, how would that affect B theory?
Oh man.
And great question, Aaron. This is exactly what
question.
I wanted. We needed something. This is a Joe Rogan-esque question. That's not insulting, by the way. To keep this scientific academic stuff fun. So great question.
No, that's an absolutely fantastic question. I got to think of how I want to approach this. So with Einsteinian relativity, a lot hinges in Einstein's description of relativity on the speed of light. Einstein uses the speed of light to kind of found his physical definitions, his operational definitions of time. You can see this. There's actually Einstein, by the way, just complete side note, and please don't let me lose track of that question because it's a great question. Einstein, by the way, extremely readable. I would highly recommend. Even his early scientific articles aren't math heavy, and Einstein had a really awesome knack for explaining things in deceptively simple ways, which made his appeal like why. So there's a wonderful book that he wrote. It's actually based off a series of lectures. It's called The Meaning of Relativity. These are a series of lectures that he actually gave at an American university, explaining some of the general principles of relativity. Also, by the way, check out his On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, the first paper that he wrote about relativity. Like, actually pretty readable, even for a layperson, for a non-scientist, which is what I am. It's digestible, it's understandable. Okay, so back to the question.
Just so everyone knows, I've already got a link in the description. If you purchase that, you'll help the channel grow. So there you go. Link in the description. Awesome. Link in the comments. Keep going.
Okay, so it could build a telescope that can look into the quote future. How would that affect B theory? All right. So our ability to look into the past is directly correlated with and related to the speed of light. And the speed of light actually plays a fundamental role in Einstein's theory of relativity, because the speed of light provides a constant reference point to develop measures of time. if there wasn't a speed of light, Einstein's theory falls apart. If there wasn't a constant speed to the speed of light, I should say, Einstein's theory would fall apart because it provides a physical basis for his understanding of time that was crucial to him, especially early on before other empirical data started to come in, like in the 1920s and the 1930s. So what Einstein says is that, very loosely speaking, time moves at the speed of light. So the further the distance, the further light has to travel, the potentially the larger time dilation can take place. Which is why when we look into a telescope at distant objects, why those objects appear to be in the past, it's not that they're in the past. This is why language is super important, right? Because in the past implies that you have this box that's the past and that object's in that box. What's happening there, the reason why it appears to us to be in the past is because of that light coming back, and with that light is the information about that object. So it's actually the light that is giving us the appearance that we're looking at that object in the past. If you were to instantaneously snap yourself, like the Goku instant transmission, not to show my anime cards here, right? If you were to instantaneously transport yourself to that object, it wouldn't appear how it just appeared to you through the telescope. So I don't, and again, not a scientist. I don't think that theoretical there that was proposed, could you look into the future, build a telescope to look into the future, I don't think that would happen. Because again, we're talking about light travel, and we're talking about the information that's being quote unquote carried with the light. And in terms of relativity, you can look into the past, right? But the speed of light, since it's constant, it can't go faster than itself. You wouldn't be able to see light from the future.
Right. Okay.
Now that's a very that's a philosopher's answer to a very scientific question.
Okay, I'm going to throw some. We can go back to the historical developments, but I think I'm going to just throw some random, or maybe this actually has more to do. Maybe it's part of the historical developments. But when I was a kid, my dad tried to explain to me the concepts of relativity. I think it was relativity or time. And so he was like, imagine you're on a train. And this is different to your example, I think, but imagine you're on a train and you're shooting backwards at the speed of light, and you're looking at a clock face. That clock face is would stay still, right? Because the time, from your perception, the time is staying still because the light can't reach your face. The clock would still be moving, but the time would not. The light from the clock would not reach your face in time, right? Is that right? In time. Oh my gosh, I sound so dumb. Baby brain is like not having enough sleep is a real thing. My holy crap. Do you get what I'm saying? So if you're yeah.
No, I think if I follow it correctly, I think that would be correct. So what causes time dilation? What causes fluctuations in time, or what causes objects really far out in space to appear in the past, is a direct result of light. So if you take that analogy that you just gave, if I understand it correctly, so me, the observer, I'm looking at a clock out in the distance.
Oh no, you're looking at the clock, I guess in the same cart as you.
Okay.
And you're shooting backwards at the speed of light. But looking at the clock. So if you're going back, just at regular speed, you'll see the clock ticking at the same speed.
Right,
but if you're going back at the speed of light, the clock should stay still because the light is traveling towards your face. But here's the thing, and this is pretending that we could create such a device, which is impossible. Right. But if we were to do that, what would happen if we went faster than the speed of light? Would the clock start going backwards? Mm-hmm. And that's the question that.
Yes, it's a really good question. And it's thought experiments like this that made people in the early 1915s and 1920s lose their freaking minds. Like they just could not. And I don't know if I still can understand, but it's difficult because Einstein, an important thing to remember is that in these thought experiments, Einstein's talking theoretically. And most of this is based off of mathematical calculations. And so when he talks about clocks, he's talking about the theoretical clock. Right. He's not talking about an actual physical clock. And we're talking like theoretically what would happen if you would approach the speed of light, because as you said, that's physically impossible. So like, as long as we keep it abstract and as long as we stay theoretically, I can't see a problem. Now, physicists might be able to see a problem with the thought experiment, but like, would the physical clock itself start moving backward? That's when we're out of my ability to answer questions.
Do you have Lauren Krause's phone number? Just give him a buzz real quick. And
yeah, that'd be nice. Right?
Probably hate me, by the way. We have I think a special guest in the chat. Is this the Maya that you're going on the channel for this?
Yeah. Hey, Maya.
So Maya is here in the chat. Thank you for popping in. So you're going on to her channel this week, is it?
It's Sunday 2:00. Yes.
Awesome. So make sure you go over there, subscribe to Maya's channel, and also may as well be a good time to make sure people go subscribe to your channel. Your channel is fantastic. It deep dives into some really, really interesting content. And you can see I watched a few of your videos on this channel. But where is the one that I was watching last night?
Those are my lives.
Oh, these are your lives. One of the most fantastic interviews you've done that I really appreciated was Virtue, Ethics, and Christianity with Michael Jones.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone gives Michael Jones, a lot of atheists give Michael Jones a bad rap. Fuck that noise. Michael Jones is a badass dude. He's so kind and friendly. If you treat him that way as well. So I really like Michael. We're good friends. And that's a really great episode. So many good episodes on here. I've been on the channel a few times. So go subscribe to Michael as well and subscribe to Maya.
Yeah.
IP rocks, I agree. He's a cool guy as far as what do I say? I say he's the most intellectually honest apologist as an apologist can be, I think. So I really like Michael.
He's a wonderful person to talk to. Very kind to me, at least. And I interview people from different faith backgrounds. I recently interviewed Carlson from the Midnight Mormons. I've interviewed people from Hindu backgrounds. I'm trying to find a Muslim scholar to interview, but religion and the history of religion is a kind of a pet side project of mine. So
yeah, it's super well balanced, like interviews, really respectful, nice. It's cool. I like it. It's the kind of thing I had it on last night. I had a little baby Atlas, and I had it on last night watching it while feeding him a bottle. So yeah.
Well, you're actually a big inspiration for that, David. You are. Let me dote on you for a little bit. One of my favorite interviewers out there. Easy.
Oh, wow! Thank you.
The breadth of people that you've interviewed, like from the different backgrounds and the different subject matters, I think speaks to your ability as an interviewer. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm trying very hard. I'm even considering going to a speech person so I can stop mumbling so much and saying and then saying anyway, all right. Back to thank you for the compliments. Everyone make sure you go subscribe to Maya, go subscribe to Michael Granado. So back to the development of time. So where should we go from here, Michael?
Yeah, let's maybe do a little bit of history since we've been doing all this philosophical jargon.
Mm-hmm.
Start early 20th century. So, like I said before, discussions and talks and debates about time go all the way back. Some of the earliest philosophic schools that we have is they were talking and debating about time because it's such a basic feature of our reality. Where this gets complicated is with science. The first full scientific treatment of time comes from Isaac Newton in Newton's Principle of Mathematics, in which Newton argued that space and time are absolutes, that they are absolute fundamental features of the universe. And Newton would take that a step further and say absolute fundamental features of God, but different story for a different day. We talked about this the last time I was on here, so we can reference that. Now, for most of the 17th and 18th century, people accepted Newton's accounts of physics because Newton was an absolute genius. And the system of physics that he developed, his theory of gravity especially, dominated science for 200 years easy. It wasn't until the 19th century that people started to cast some questions and have some doubts about the Newtonian picture of the universe. This came in a bunch of different forms. One of the biggest ways that people started questioning Newton was actually in the form of debates and discussions about light itself. So Newton was the first person to develop a theory of optics, why things have colors. He wrote an entire book on it called Optics. Thomas Young, who was a British scientist in the 19th century, don't quote me on that, was the first person to start to provide experiments with light that started to diverge from Newton's account. And the biggest way that Young's description of light diverged is that Newton argued that light was a particle, that the light we see are these little tiny particles coming from the source that's hitting our eyes, and our brains are interpreting what they're saying. He called them corpuscles. It's just an ancient way of saying particles. Thomas Young argued that light actually behaved and moved in wave forms. So Young was the first to develop this double slit experiment, which creates patterns, wave-like patterns that we can observe through light. In addition to Young, you have the development in the 19th century, super nerdy, I'm sorry. The development of non-Euclidean geometry in the 19th century. So Euclidean geometry was pretty straightforward in the sense that people believed that mathematics corresponded to reality. Yeah, this is the double slit experiment. So
can you explain what's going on here?
I can try.
Okay.
So this is the basic one devised by Young. Now Young didn't have an electric light; it was like a candle, but same basic idea. So you have the light source that's of course emitting the light, and then you have the first panel which has these slits in it. The light passes through those slits, and what you observe in that darker panel is an interference pattern. And an interference pattern for physicists, I won't be able to explain this part. An interference pattern shows wave-like function. The light particles are dispersed in wave-like patterns. So the reason why this is important is because if light was a particle, like Newton had suggested, you shouldn't have all those different slits that appear, slits of light. You should just have one of those.
Right.
Because if light was one thing, particles move in one direction, right? And you can predict the motion of that particle. In the same way, let's expand it up for a second. In the same way that you could track and predict the motion of a car that's driving down a highway, you ought to be able to do the same thing with the pattern. There's one place that car is going, and there's one expected outcome or location that car is going. But with light, you observe something different.
So even and what I know, I think about this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we can now measure it obviously with a single photon. So one photon of light can come through, and it can land on this board. And if you cover one of the slits, it still acts as if there is that interference pattern, but as if there was two, as if so. Yeah, you can fire one photon, one photon, one photon, one photon, and then you still get this same wave, which means that there's that light acts as a wave as well as a particle. So it's like a bit of both.
Yeah. So that's what we come to understand in the 20th century.
So that's my Big Bang Theory TV show analysis of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we started to get these questions in the 19th century with discoveries about light and new developments of new mathematical systems, which leads us to the 20th century. And in the 20th century is when Einstein's the one that kicks all this off. It's actually pretty rare in the history of science for a single individual to make like such a monumentous breakthrough. It's almost always done as a team or by a group of people, but Einstein and Newton, respectively, are like the stereotypical soul geniuses, right? And Einstein starts to develop this idea based off of a couple of big things: the new developments that had taken place about light, but also a very, very important experiment which was done in the late 19th century was called the Michelson-Morley experiment. And what the Michelson-Morley experiment was probably one of the most famous scientific failures. So in the big question about light is, how does light move? So you have these conversations about light's a particle, light's a wave, what is it, right? The more fundamental question is, what does light move through? So we have light waves, and the idea was that, we have sound waves. Well, sound moves through the medium of air. That's how like hearing works, right? And again, not my area, but the sound comes to us, hits our eardrums, it vibrates, and then we hear what we hear, right? And so the thought process was, well, a similar mechanism ought to be happening with light. And that mechanism, that medium that was proposed, going back to Newton, was this thing called the ether. Newton said that there is this substance called the ether which pervaded all of space, and that the ether was the mechanism through which light moved. So if light is the car, the ether is the highway, to use an analogy. Well, the Michelson-Morley experiment was an attempt to detect, it assumed that the ether existed, and it was an attempt to detect whether or not the Earth moving through space would experience ether drag. And this is just as bad as my description about philosophy. I'm sorry. But so you have space and you have the Earth rotating around the sun, right? Well, the thought process was, if the ether exists, then the ether would be causing some pushback on the motion of the Earth, in the same way that a car going down the highway is going to get some resistance and some drag from the wind. So the Michelson-Morley experiment was an attempt to measure the ether drag, the effect that the ether was having on the Earth, to learn more about the ether. The results of the Michelson-Morley experiment were null. There were no observable effects. And this caused people to fundamentally doubt whether or not the ether was a thing. So Einstein comes along, he reads this experiment, and he's kind of taken aback by it, because everybody assumed that ether existed. And everybody assumed that ether would have some sort of effect on light, especially. Or
I've
on
had
the...
some flat earthers argue with me that the ether still does exist. So
right. I guess
that's
they
the
don't
only, that's the
accept.
only reason I don't even know what the ether is. Is because flat earthers told me that's actually how things. Anyway, keep going.
That's funny. I, for some reason, doesn't surprise me that people still think that. Yeah. Because it was a big deal at the time. It was over 100 years ago, but it's still like it dumbfounded people. Like that's like us people doing tests on gravity and realizing that, oh yeah, gravity's not really a thing. Like that was a big deal for people. Right?
Well, that's what flat earthers also thinks. Anyway,
No, say it. Yeah.
Maybe the flat earthers are right after all along.
I was about to say, I actually came on this podcast to say that the Earth is, in fact, no, I'm just kidding.
Imagine you just drop that, like, I am a flat earther, guys. I've been convinced. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. No. So yeah. So this was this created like a sort of a upheaval in turn of the century physics, turn of the 20th century physics. Like everybody was talking about this. Such a big problem. Well, Einstein is thinking about the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. He's thinking about light and the experiments that were done with light. And because Einstein was a gigantic nerd, he's also thinking about trains and clocks. And so he's putting together these thoughts experiments about the train leaving one station. And to be fair, like this was a super practical concern. Time zones, as y'all know, or you may know, didn't really come along till a little bit later. I don't know exactly when, so don't quote me on that. But international travel started to become more and more popular and accessible come the 20th century. So by the early 20th century, people are flying, not flying yet, not yet. People are taking boats and trains from France to Germany and from Germany to Italy, and they're taking boats from the UK to America. Well, now all of a sudden, this question of time is not just a theoretical question, it's a practical question. What happens when I take my clock from the UK, hop on a boat, and sail all the way to the Americas? Why is my clock different from the clock at the Times Square now?
Mm-hmm.
So Einstein's thinking about all of this, and he takes those questions about trains and clocks and light and applies it to light, and he finds some troubling results. The troubling result is that some of the basic concepts that we had about time, specifically concepts about simultaneity, events happening at the same time, that simultaneity was no longer an absolute.
I have an image to pop up.
Yes, that's it. Good. Yes. So the both Einstein and Heisenberg will call into question certain basic assumptions that people had held to be true. The question that Einstein's going to call into question is this idea of whether or not something can happen at the same time to two observers. And Einstein's going to say, depending upon the speed of one of the observers, there's no absolute simultaneity because there's no absolute time. And so we have a slow unraveling of the entire Newtonian worldview. So this is a picture of the train experiment. So you have a stationary observer who's on the train platform watching the train go down the tracks. And you have another observer on the train. And you have the events B and A, lightning strike, that happen for the stationary person, Y, happen, quote, at the same time. Mm-hmm. Now, the question that Einstein raises is, will those lightning strikes appear to happen at the same time for both observers? The guy on the train and Y. And Einstein's answer to that question is no.
Would it be perceivably no, or would it just be no? Like
it would be perceivably no.
Really?
That the guy on the train would experience the lightning strike at A before he experienced the lightning strike at B.
Interesting. Because of his movement, right?
Because of the movement, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that question that you just had is the question that literally every single philosopher and scientist who read Einstein's paper, they're going to say like, whoa. Hold up a second.
Yeah.
Hold up a second. So the first question they're going to raise is like, well, how is this possible? But they're going to get more specific and say like, physically, how is this possible? Like, let's assume that Einstein's right. There's this debate that erupts in a conference that happened in Paris in 1911. And there's this French philosopher named Levinston who stands up and says like, who basically does like the stereotypical like argumentative philosopher thing and says, hey, listen, by the way, there's no absolute sense of time anymore. There's no absolute sense of simultaneity. We all have different times. Your time's different from 9 time, and I can prove it using Einstein. And people like verbal arguments, like people were standing up, like shouting at each other and arguing with each other. It was great.
Wow.
And the question is over whether or not this thought experiment applies to biological time.
Yeah.
So if we were to physically carry out this experiment, their question was the same as your question. Would that person physically, biologically experience time differently? And Einstein will double down and say, yes, they would.
Wow, that's interesting.
And of course, that, like, what is that? How do we wrap our heads around that? Right. That's the big question.
I don't know if this is a good time to talk about the twin paradox. To jump straight into another thought experiment. But it's my understanding that the twin paradox, like, has actually happened with like astronauts that have spent time in space.
Yeah,
very slightly, not noticeably, but not perceivably, but it's accurately. So, can you explain the twin paradox for us?
Yeah. So, really simply, the twin paradox is you take 2 identical twins, you put one in a rocket ship. Well, before you do that, you give them both clocks. You sync their clocks together, start the clocks. You put one in the rocket ship, send them out into space, have the twin in the rocket ship approach the speed of light, come back to Earth. There we go. And when the twin comes back to Earth, what will they see? What will they encounter? That the person who stayed on Earth would have grown significantly older, while the twin in the rocket ship would have remained basically the same age.
So if you could literally like shoot out at the speed of light for like 6 months, you come back and your twin would be 10 years older than you, or something like that, right?
Exactly. And this raises further questions about the difference between physical time and biological time.
Okay.
And what Einstein will say, even though Einstein's not a biologist, and even though none of these experiments had been carried out, it wasn't until recently that we actually did the twin paradox experiment. What Einstein will say, he'll be committed to this idea that biological time will have to resemble physical time because there's no different, they're the same thing. But the difference would be that biological time is just a measure of time that's limited to my body, right? I have my own biological clock in the form of my physical body. And so the twin paradox will raise this raises the question of time travel, right? Which is what I get asked about a lot. And my answer to this question of time travel is that time travel in relativity theory, I can't speak for wormholes and quantum mechanic time travel, like what we just saw with like Ant-Man and stuff like that. We're not talking about that. Time travel in relativity theory is actually like not very sexy. Not as sexy as the movie Time Travel, because Einstein's theory of relativity assumes B theory of time. Time is relational to the observer. So if we have 2 observers, time is relational to the movement of each person. So time travel is only possible for one of them. And it's only possible in relation to that other observer. You don't travel through time in this sense in the same way that the car travels down the road. It can go forward and backward. That sort of travel is not possible. What is possible in the twin paradox, what the twin paradox shows us is that one twin will biologically age while the other does not in relation to each other.
So, okay. So, a couple of things. One, Anazia, I hope that's how I say your name, said, but how? Which is a great question.
Exactly.
And secondly, Slam RN keeps talking about the Kelly twins. Now, when I said it's been tested, I literally thought it was like hypothetically tested, as in like they've sent a twin to. Okay, can you tell me a little bit about the Kelly twins then?
I don't really know anything about this. All I can say is that this was so the Kelly twins are astronauts, or at least one of them was an astronaut, identical twins, and they physically tested this by literally carrying out the one twin. They both were given clocks. Those clocks were synced. One of the twins spent time on the International Space Station, and when they came down, we're talking fractions of a second here.
Yeah.
But the twin who was on the space station's clock was a little slower than the other twins. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, because because in order for it to work, you have to be going at like incredibly fast speeds. And so, on the space station, you're going at fast speeds and nowhere near as fast enough, but he spent like 6 months or something up there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And there was a slight time difference. So if we can take that example and amplify the speed of the person in space and amplify the amount of time that they spend in space, the greater the time gap gets, is what that means. So yeah, we actually empirically verify this, which is mind-blowing.
Wow.
Absolutely mind-blowing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's so crazy. Wow. Yeah, so to Anazia's question, how?
So this is the fun part where I get to say
I don't know.
Yeah. It's mind-blowing. I mean, I'm right there with you. I've been reading about Einstein, and I've been reading about all of the multifaceted philosophical implications of the twin paradox and the train experiment for literally the past 6 years, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It's a great question.
Slam RN also points out that it changes depending on where how heavy the gravity. How heavy? My gosh, how intense the gravity is. So like around a black hole, for example, if you could like somehow sit on the cusp of a black hole, time does some really weird things. Can you explain a little bit about that?
No, I can't.
I was right at the edge. Right. I was right at the edge of my reasoning. I was like, I was throwing the ball in there, hoping you could catch it, but none of us.
No, you're right. You're right. Again, black holes, I don't think didn't come around and weren't theorized until like the 60s and 70s. I think is when Hawking first released his equations, and my knowledge of the history of science stops at the 40s. So that's where I cut it off.
That gravity is pretty heavy, Anna. I promise I'm not this dumb. I'm just really tired, but I'm trying. So so how does this? So maybe we could wrap up the historical developments by just talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yeah. Let's just cover all the controversial stuff. No. This is without a doubt one of those areas that I think we might have Jesus and the history of religion people beat here in terms of misquoting and misunderstanding. There's so much woohoo is the right word surrounding the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But so 20th century physics is defined by two two major developments. First and foremost is relativity theory, without a doubt, which is what I already talked about, developed by Albert Einstein. 1905 is the first paper. 1920 is the first lectures that's delivered. By 1922, we have our first empirical evidence confirming relativity theory. Also starting in the 1920s, this goes back a little prior to this, in the 19th century, with conversations about atoms and subatomic particles, especially with the invention and development of the microscopes. In the early 20th century, along with the development of relativity, you have the development of, at the time it was called microphysics, what today we call quantum mechanics, which is the physics of really, really small stuff. So just what that translates to. So Heisenberg publishes his paper in 1925. And this is how Bachelard explains it. What Einstein does to time and simultaneity, Einstein fundamentally calls into question the understanding of our understanding of simultaneity with his paper. Heisenberg will do the same thing with location and place. So again, one of our most basic intuitions about reality is that, this sounds stupid to say, things have locations. Things are located in space, right?
Yeah.
The pin is located right here. Well, it's actually not so silly and stupid, because as it turns out, Heisenberg will take that definition and understanding of location and we just throw it out the window. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle deals with the location of the electron around the nucleus of an atom. And this gets complicated, and this all of what I'm telling you now is from a book that Bachelard wrote on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's called The Concept of Space and Physics. Currently untranslated. I'm trying to get it published, so any publishers out there. So he takes this idea and he says that so Heisenberg takes this idea of the location of the electron. At an everyday level, this is pretty straightforward, right? Think back to your high school physics class. If you were tracking the movement of a car, let's say, and I gave you the speed of the car and the direction the car is going, and I pinpointed where the car is currently located on the map, you would be able to tell me where that car would be in an hour or 2 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty straightforward, yeah. Right? Not me.
Yeah.
Again, I failed high school algebra.
I'd Google it. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is what our current GPS satellite positions are based off of, right? They could do it like in an instant. You'll arrive at your destination in an hour and 30 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. That is fundamentally impossible to do at a quantum level. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that you can track the speed of an electron, or you could track the position of the electron, but you can't track both. Well, you could try to. It's just as many times as you do the experiment, that's how many results you're going to get. Different results.
Whoa.
Yeah. So Bachelard says that Heisenberg complexifies our understanding of location.
Yeah.
He makes complicated this very simple idea that object A is located here, and says at a big level, yes, but at a quantum level, we can't exactly say that. You could say one, but not the other, right? There's actually an equation for it that I won't attempt to recite. Now, this has to do with a couple of reasons. One of which is not super sexy. The other one's a little bit sexier. The first reason that has to do with is limitations in our technology. Because quantum objects are so small, electrons are going to be physically affected by photons. So the microscope, in the act of observing the location of the electron, let's say that my left fist is the electron. As the electron's moving, that photon's going to come in and disrupt it, knock it out of place. And so this is where this idea of the act of observation affects the result. Here's the misunderstanding. It's not consciousness that's affecting the result of the experiment. It's the physical photons from the light that's impacting the experiment. So it's not this like our consciousness affects reality. It's our sight it's the photons from our sight that's affecting the reality. If that makes sense.
I'll rewatch this stream when it is posted, because like I'm right on the cusp of following along. I think, yeah.
But it goes even deeper than that. So on the one hand, we have this measurement problem. Okay, so the question is going to be, well, what if we improve our tools? What if we get better microscopes? Would we be able to fix the measurement problem? And Heisenberg still says no. That even with the best microscopes that we're able to develop, that there is a fundamental uncertainty at the quantum level in the results that we're going to get. So here's Bachlard's interpretation of that. Here's the kicker. Here's the upshot of all of this. And this is where we're going to move away from the science and get a little bit more philosophical. So the big problem that Bachelard is trying to figure out is, why is our physical descriptions of time in physics, why are they so different from our everyday experience of time? That's the original problem that we started with, right? Bachelard's answer to that question is that they're actually not all that different. And although our surface level appearance of time seems to us to conflict with physics, the more we rationally understand and analyze it, the more we realize that it's physics all the way down. So Bachelard takes Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and says that the experience of time is the same as the experience of the electron. And that when we understand quantum objects and quantum particles, we have to do so, I'm going to introduce another mathematical term, topologically. So we can understand the probability distribution of the electron, but we can't isolate and study the electron in and of itself. It's not going to give us much information if we do that. And it's not going to lead us to any much useful information if we do that. So instead, we have to use Bachelard's words, analyze it from the top down, topologically. Then once we do this, we can get an understanding of how quantum particles work in toto, as a whole, as opposed to individually. Bachelard says that time, as we experience it, works analogously to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, in that we experience time in these instantaneous moments. We have these moments of consciousness in which we consciously act in time. But Bachelard says it doesn't do us any good, and he's arguing against Bergson here, but he says it doesn't do us any good to isolate those moments to try to figure out, okay, well, what is the quality of time in that particular moment? Or what is the fundamental aspect of time that remains the same? Instead, what we have to do is interpret the flow or movement of our life as a whole in the same way that we interpret musically a song. So songs can be broken down into individual notes, the ABC. I don't know anything about music, but we don't hear, when we listen to music, we don't hear like one note, another note, another note, another. We hear it as a whole.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, that's a great analogy.
I can't take any credit for it, but it's all Bachelard. Yeah. So we see it as a whole, right? And so this is Bachelard says how we have to approach the time of our lives. And why this is important is because this is how, to use a psychological term, this is how narrative meaning works in our lives. The narrative meaning is the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. So when we look at narrative meaning, we're not approaching it from a particular moment. We're approaching it topologically from a whole. And this is important because individual moments, think about the most traumatic thing that ever happened. You don't think about that. You can think about the happiest thing that ever happened to you, right? Individual moments for Bachelard, the reason why this analogy is important is because they're flexible, they're malleable. What an event meant to us one day can mean something different to us the next day. What happened, that traumatic experience that I'm thinking of from my childhood that scarred me for life and put me in therapy all these years, I can years later in my therapist office say, well, you know what? I actually learned something from that. So we have this time as experienced, argues Bachelard, is not the time of our lives moving from past to the future, but is rather this malleable, changeable thing, analogous to the electron, that's more similar to the descriptions that's offered by physics. So Bachelard says that we have to not trust as difficult as it is, we have to not trust our intuition or our common sense understanding, but to accept the system of rationality given to us by theories like relativity or quantum mechanics and apply it to areas that we otherwise wouldn't, such as the interpretation of our life events. And that's the sermon that I was going to give. So
Well, well done, people. If you have questions, start pouring them now. I've got a lot of things to get through. Pippa said, welcome, Pippa. They said that felt wrong. If the observer effects were the result of mere photons, it would occur when no observation takes place.
It's a measurement problem that's the result of the photons.
Okay.
I do want to emphasize that for Heisenberg, though, this is a methodology that uncertainty is there at the most bottom level, that is fundamental to quantum mechanics, but that the observer effect that is sometimes related to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is a direct result of the photon hitting the electron.
Okay.
That's what's causing the problem. Yeah. But again, not a scientist.
So if people don't know, I'm a former youth pastor, now agnostic atheist who makes these videos, does these interviews on religion, philosophy, and science. But my only credentials are really in marketing, and that's I worked in marketing for a while, and now got a postgrad degree. I somehow got into that without having a bachelor, which was cool. But but one of the other, I have a couple of certificates, a certificate in Christian ministries, but one of the other certificates I have is a certificate in geographic information systems. So I work for a surveying and town planning firm, and someone said, Slim Aaron said, when they sent the first satellites, scientists told the engineers that they would have to allow for the slowing of time, like for GPS. The engineers did not believe this, but put on a system in case. Turns out the scientists were correct. And that brings me to a funny anecdote that happened in the surveying community. And two things. One reason I know that the Earth is not flat, going back to the flat Earth things, is we have to put algorithms in our data recorders that project 2D plans onto a spherical Earth, right? Because when you're making plans in the computer, and you're talking seconds of degrees and millimeters of height, you have to project them onto a spherical Earth, and depending on if you're going over 200 meters or something for a set out, it makes a slight difference. So that formula is there, and yet I've explained this to my friends and family who are flat earthers, and they just, I don't know what they do. But what was really interesting is in the surveying industry, our GPS systems in, I think, 2010 just went whack, and like not to a consumer level, but to a spatial scientist level. Well, like, why the world was like, why are our GPS systems going funny? And the reason is because China built a dam that was so big that it put a wobble in the Earth's orbit.
What?
So
Really?
yeah, 100%. Yeah, the Three Georges Dam, it slowed the orbit of the Earth and it put a wobble in our orbit, so much so that our GPS systems went out of whack, and we had to put they had to work out they had to put compensation algorithms into the into the instruments to account for this wobble of this slowing. It's really really interesting.
That's wild.
Yeah. Thank you, Pippa, for showing up. Though it was really nice to see some new faces in the comments. It's great to see that. We also so question for Michael. Why does time move faster on Sunday afternoon than on Wednesday morning?
It's a fantastic question. Yeah. So this ties into something that I forgot to say. And so let me say it and then I'll answer this. So another thing that complicates this question and discussion about time. So I made this distinction between physical time as described by physics, biological time as experienced by biological organisms. An aspect of biological time is our psychological experience of time. And part of the reason why people objected so much to Einstein, there's a lot going on there, but psychology hadn't really developed into its own science yet. And so, for example, Einstein and Henry Bergson get into this big debate. Bergson's objections are primarily psychological, because for Bergson, time, you can't talk about time without talking about our psychological experience of time. And Einstein outright dismisses that. Einstein actually says there is no time of the philosophers. And by philosophers, he means psychologists. So he was pretty much wrong about that. But just want to throw that out there, that there was actually like legitimate grounds for that discussion. And the legitimate grounds was that psychology wasn't really a thing yet. But the people who were like proto-French psychologists were saying, well, wait a second, we can actually like measure this stuff. Like we can actually like run these experiments. And so to get back to Titan's question, which was why does time feel like it flows faster on Sunday? Go ahead.
No, I was just laughing.
Okay. The answer to that is that we have this like old adage that time flies when you're having fun. Like that's observable. Like most people report that happening. The same way that time goes by really slow when you're sitting at work and waiting for it to hit 5 o'clock and you're staring at the clock and it seems like it's moving like incredibly slow. Yeah, like, and again, I can't speak to this because I'm not a psychologist, but there's a ton of research out there. There's a book by there's a psychologist I really like named David Engelman, I believe is his last name. He has this paper called Brain Time and Physical Time. I can't remember the exact description, but he talks a lot about this. And this has been something that's been observed like across the board. So there is something to that. I said all that to say that, yes, there is something in fact to that. But ask a psychologist about it, not me.
So Aaron said, I feel like I would both understand this subject better and worse if I was studying. I would agree, except I'll be having a panic attack. So question for Michael. After all your research and study, what is time to you?
Yeah.
Just give us the answer.
Yeah, right. If only. I lean towards, it appears to me that B theory I'm leaning more and more towards B theory.
Okay.
Now, there are some complications to that. The complication being the growing block theory, which is kind of a hybrid of A theory and B theory of time that has gotten increasing support by some physicists. But I'll tell you, the person that I default to is an Italian scientist named Carlo Rovelli, who wrote an absolutely fantastic book called I think it's called The Order of Time or The Nature of Time. He's one of the clearest writers, physicist out there that's writing about time. Ravelli is also, unlike other physicists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who hate philosophy, unjustly so, Ravelli is philosophically literate. I'm just going to take random shots at famous scientists.
Do it. It'll be. I'll cut into shorts and we'll
Tyson,
get some traction.
if you ever want to debate me about the validity of philosophy, I'm more than happy to accept. And I'll rest.
He definitely watches. Neil deGrasse Tyson is actually a big watcher of this podcast. I'll just say he loves it. He's always emailing me afterwards.
But Carlo Ravelli, and he's wonderful to listen to because he's got this beautiful Italian accent. But yeah, he's also very philosophically literate, and he's written a couple papers on defending the relationist account of time, and that's what I find most convincing now. But this is also a reflection of my background, which is exploring the history of relativity, and the history of relativity up until general relativity is more closely aligned with B theory. Now, other scientific theories, especially once we start getting into space-time and time within quantum mechanics, people have made the argument that maybe it's a growing block. But I'm leaning more now towards B theory. If I had to choose, if you put a gun to my head and made me choose life or death situation, I'd say B theory. But I'm only like 60% sure about that.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's, I know nothing, and B theory feels more intuitive to me. So I got a couple more last questions, but I did want to quickly mention something, and this is big. Well, I'm mentioning that I will have some big news. The biggest thing that Deep Drinks has ever done, and I've ever done ever on the internet, will be announced sometime in the next week. This has been in the works and for a little while, and I'm very excited to tell everyone about it. It's I've only told some close personal friends that we've finally locked it in, but stay tuned. In the next week, hopefully, I'll have an official announcement. And you can also connect on Discord to get involved in the conversation. I've been pushing really hard for Deep Drinks, trying to get Deep Drinks across to over 1,000 subscribers, because that's the magic number where I can start getting super chats and things like that, which will help me continue to do this and get some more interesting guests. Some guests require speaking fees. I also want to travel around and do in-person interviews. I want to create more content, and I eventually want to do this full-time, hopefully. So I've been going nuts with Baby Atlas by my side, making shorts. So if you like, flick through some of these shorts that I've been creating. They take me like 5 hours to edit, actually. They're actually put a lot of work into making them snappy. But they'll show like episodes that you can watch and share it with all your friends. But mainly, stay tuned for this really cool, big news. I'm super excited. I can't wait to tell everyone.
It is exciting.
So I'll tell you after we get off.
I was about to say.
So I got a question from Lauren. I'll just post this, and Lauren is the friend that I was talking to last night. She hasn't been able to watch live. Why do you think psychedelics and ketamine changes the perceiver's perspective on time? So a big thing that I hear amongst my friends who have engaged in such activities is that they're like, I lived a million lifetimes in 2 minutes. Why do you think that is?
Oh, man. Yeah. It's a good question. Well, I think that this does show us something about the nature of time, which is I don't want to discount the psychological experience of time. And at the same time, I want to emphasize Bachelard's point, which is that the psychological experience of time might be closer than we initially thought to descriptions of physical time. And the reason why I bring that up in this case is that for Einstein especially, time is intimately linked with the observer. Time is relative and relational to the observer. So one observer is going to experience time differently from another observer. And with psychedelics and with other drugs that you start to introduce to your body that start to affect the chemical makeup of your brain, the fact that it affects time speaks to the relative nature of it.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
That's what I think. It's like, you know, how you put people in an MRI or something when they're on type of sort of shrooms or something. Once again, also, I'm not advocating for the use of psychedelics. I know that they can be, there's some research that they can be really beneficial under the right context, but I also have friends and family who have misused them to the point where they've ended up in mental institutions. I'm not advocating for anyone to take them unless under professional situations, but people who take like large amounts of shrooms or something under an MRI, you can see that their brain, like parts of their brain, are active that aren't normally active, and it's almost like you know how like the you know, when you're talk like the quote by Einstein, that probably isn't by Einstein, but that's hang on, something's going a bit funny. That quote by Allison, that, you know, if you're talking to a pretty lady, that, you know, time will go really slow, or if you're on a Sunday, time will go really, or a pretty man. I'm not trying to be biased here, but the thing is like, you know, maybe parts of your brain are lighting up differently, and that's why like you're more aware socially. So maybe when you're doing psychedelics, those parts of your brain are just like firing, and as a result you perceive time differently. I don't know, that's my thoughts.
That makes sense to me. I'm sure there's a psychologist out there who could speak to it and kind of break it down and explain it better, but I think what this reveals philosophically is that there's an element to time that is, one, highly subjective, and two, physically dependent upon our perception of it. I think those would be the important takeaways there. Yeah.
Cool. So I have a question that I ask all guests. So when you're on here the first time, I asked you, I'm pretty sure I asked you, what, if anything, would change your mind? That's a question I like to ask everyone. And I also ask you, what's your favorite type of afterlife, if you could choose one? And you gave a really interesting one. You gave the Egyptian afterlife, which was cool.
Right.
But I have a question now. That it's not really related to time, but as we wrap up, I'd like to ask a deep question. What is the most plausibly true religion that you don't believe in?
Oh boy, you just had to throw something like that in there, huh? Most plausibly true religion. Well, let me relate it to time real quick.
Yeah.
So there's some religious traditions, not religions, because the religious traditions I'm thinking of are from Christianity, but Christians have vastly different views of God. And there's an entire tradition within Christianity about Christian theologians and philosophers reflecting on the relationship between God and time. So, as I mentioned before, people like Newton believed that absolute time was a fundamental feature of God. And some theologians and philosophers' conception of God is directly tied into kind of strict atheist accounts of God, or of time. So I am more, and I'm not going to tell religious people what to believe or how they should believe, because that's stupid.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But,
yeah.
But this applies to philosophy as well, by the way. I think your philosophical and or religious ideas should at least be scientifically coherent. So, or at least scientifically plausible, or at least not scientifically contradictory. So there are certain types of arguments. For example, the Kalam cosmological argument put forward by philosophers, theologians like William Lane Craig. That argument's actually predicated on a particular view of a theory of time.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
That the universe had a beginning and that everything begins to exist.
Yeah, I
Whatever.
never thought about that.
Right.
How interesting.
And if you listen to Craig, he actually has to commit himself to a defense of a theory of time because of that.
Wow.
But, and to Craig's point, to Craig's credit, I should say, he'll offer mathematical proofs. The issue is that the empirical evidence seems to suggest otherwise. And so for me, you're kind of fighting a losing battle there. To have an entire philosophical, in this case, and also a religious idea hinge upon a theory of time that's not super commonly accepted. Yeah, so Craig support. I believe it's been a while since I read any of his stuff, but he supports an A theory of time, the growing block theory of time. So he'll say that that the past was real and that the present's real. But he does have to commit himself to a form of A theory. And if you look at his actual book that he wrote about the Kalam, he actually goes into more detail about that. Yeah. But I think and I've had conversations with philosophers. These are people that aren't even religious. I don't want to bust myself out here on the off chance that my thesis advisor listens to He doesn't listen to anything.
Well,
he
maybe
won't
Neil deGrasse Tyson, which listens to this.
I'm actually more afraid of my thesis advisor, but because at least he understands philosophy, unlike Tyson. But I presented to a group of philosophers a couple of weeks ago, and they said, well, I just really prefer what Bergson has to say about time. And I think that Bergson's description of time is more like fundamental. But when you take that position, like what they're not admitting is that Bergson's account of time is at odds with our basic understanding of relativity. So like, why would you put yourself in that position? It's like me saying like, Darwin was cool, but I'm not sure I'm super on board with the whole like evolution thing. Like you're putting yourself in that's an uphill battle, man. That's tough. So I would say the same thing in terms of scientifically plausible, so long as it doesn't conflict with basic established scientific theories, it's cool. I would be okay with that. Yeah.
Cool. Just to shout out some upcoming streams as well, talking about William Lane Craig. We have 2 guests coming on. I haven't created the promo for them. I just got the email confirmations the last 2 days, but we have the Majesty of Reason coming on, who actually has conversations with William Lane Craig, and he's a critic of the Kalam cosmological argument. Nice. Someone said Kalam fails in P1 logically anyway. Titan said that. You say that, but there are a lot of people who still find the Kalam convincing. So the conversation we'll be having with Majesty of Reason is why that is. Why do they find it convincing? What can we give a best faith interpretation of the Kalam? And we also have James Fodder coming on, who is a university student from Melbourne. He's a neuroscientist as well. So he'll be talking about we'll be talking about a lot of the same things, philosophy and things like that. So both really exciting guests to come on. But Michael, it's been fantastic having a conversation with you, and great answers to so many questions. Thank you so much. Make sure everyone go check out his channel. Make sure you subscribe to Deep Drinks. This helps us get to 1,000 subscribers, and we'll see you all guys another time. Michael, is there anything else you want to say before we leave?
No, I really appreciate it, David. It's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you. If you're interested in learning more about David, I've interviewed David a few times on my channel. If you want to go check out those videos, highly recommend them.
I think that to be fair too, most people don't come here for me, but if but there is let me just quickly go to your channel. This interview we did, let me just see. This interview we did here
Yeah.
with a staggering 89 views, which obviously because people don't really care. I put a lot of work into flashing out my positions here, and so so I think this is a good interview to watch. I think it's relatively interesting if you want to know where I build my worldview from. And that's a great show. Thank you, Deep Drinks Podcast. Thank you so much. Really appreciate those comments. And I'll see you guys all next week, which we're still up in the air with a guest, but we do have someone tentatively planned. So see you guys and look forward to seeing that big announcement coming up. See you later.
Can't wait.